Hey everyone, I'm Cyanide, your 4-star guy, and you must be a hardcore gamer, yeah? You looked at the thumbnail and saw advanced mechanics and thought, this is a video worth my time and expertise. But if you are a more casual player and at any point don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry, I made a basics guide to elemental reactions that you might want to consider watching first. If you want to know about elemental reactions in the first place, what each reaction does, and how their damage is scaled. And don't worry, this video is going to stay right here for you to come back to, and it is mostly going to be covering pretty small details that only help us a little bit when making optimization decisions. A basic understanding of elemental reactions is all you really need for most of the game. I figured I'd make this video because I am about to cover Lisa in my next few videos, and I came to the realization that reactions can get pretty messy for her, but she can also be more centered around reactions than most characters. So I figured I'd take the chance to research and get it right when telling you all about what I think her best builds are. But how advanced can elemental reactions be anyway? Well, have you ever noticed that when you apply an elemental aura onto an enemy, then do a reaction, the auras disappear? But have you also noticed that sometimes if you did it the other way around, the aura stays a little while after the reaction? Well, what does this mean for us and why does it happen? What about items that give you bonus damage against enemies afflicted by certain elements? How do reactions play into this kind of damage? And why doesn't a reaction happen with every elemental hit of a multi-hit attack? There's also the age-old question of when spamming attacks of two different elements, who is triggering the reactions? We wonder this because we want to know which characters to put elemental mastery on and which ones we don't need it for. I will answer these questions in this video, or at least a way to think about these questions and maybe help you figure it out for yourself, because I can't answer for every reaction between every character. I know for me, I have always kind of strayed away from trying to invest too much in elemental mastery because I was hardly ever sure if it was going to be used, and I usually wound up just trying to up my crit and attack instead. And I imagine a lot of people are the same, but after learning what I have in this past week, I think I'm more ready to give advice regarding it. This video is going to be all about elemental application, and the variety of situations made things pretty complicated when I was testing these. But I found patterns and had some explanations I found online, so I hope I can answer these questions for you in a simple yet comprehensive way. Let's get some terminology out of the way to make explaining things faster for the rest of this video. I will refer to an elemental aura as being the element that an enemy is afflicted with, and I will use the term trigger to describe the application of a second element that causes a reaction on an enemy with a pre-existing aura. I might use the word proc, and it's kind of a simple word to mean something along the lines of inflict or apply. Let's start off with probably one of the most fundamental parts of this video, and that is about how often a reaction can happen. A common misunderstanding is that each enemy has an internal timer that doesn't allow a reaction to happen on them too often. It is true that there is a timer, but the timer is actually about how often we can apply an element. Each skill has their own timer like this, and that determines whether the next hit can apply their element or not. To show this, we can go to our good old dummy flower. I noticed that when using Barbara's normal attacks, only her first and last hits dent the shield. I know now that this shield gets damaged when an element is applied to it, especially Hydro. If regular damage was a thing that wore it out, each of her normal attacks would have helped to wear it down. Shinxio's Rain Sword, using his E, also deals no damage, but wears out the shield whenever it applies Hydro to the Regisvine, proving that application of Hydro is what is shown when using the Regisvine shield and not damage itself. If I said that each skill has their own timer of how often they can apply an element, if we use multiple skills simultaneously, could we apply more Hydro status? And yes, this is why using Barbara's skill to occasionally apply Hydro while using her normal attacks tears down the Regisvine shields a lot quicker. We can show that a timer is being used here and not just the fact that Barbara's first and last hits of her normal attacks proc Hydro. We can do this if we use Barbara's first hit of her normal attack, dash, then first hit again. It's not that it's just her first hit of her normal combo that procs Hydro, but it's the timer that allows her normal attacks to apply Hydro at certain times. If you spam her normal attacks against this Regisvine, you might also notice that after her first full combo, different hits in the chain are the ones that wear the shield down. And to show that reactions themselves don't have a timer, we'll use Amber to show why people probably thought this in the first place. Amber's ultimate hits this Electro Brick with a lot of pyro attacks, and when it's vulnerable, it constantly has an Electro aura, meaning that if there was no timer, Overloaded should happen with every single hit. But Overloaded only happens once every so often during her ult. And to show that it's actually each skill that has an application timer that determines whether a reaction happens or not, if we take Xianglin's Goba, then use Bennett's skill right after Goba's first attack, we see that both hits trigger Overloaded. Each skill has their own application timer, and there's no limit to how fast the reactions can happen on an enemy. If you're wondering whether stuff like this means that a different enemy won't be applied with an aura if your timer is not ready yet, it's actually not like that. To show rather than tell, we saw that Barba's first hit dash the first hit did not apply Hydro to the Registine twice, but if we use the same combo, making sure that the second hit hits another enemy, the second enemy will still be afflicted by Hydro. It seems like each enemy has their own separate application timer with your skills. Each skill has a different rate at which they can apply their element to. Kinda like how we can see that Lisa's ult procs Electro way more often than Fischl's Oz if we use Bennett to clear the Electro with Overloaded whenever we can to see when the next Electro proc happens. For your characters, how often they can apply their element may be something you'd want to start considering. How often we can apply elemental auras determines how often our elemental reactions can happen. Now that we've talked about that, let's try to tackle who is actually triggering the reactions when we are spamming elemental attacks. I cannot speak for every case, but let's try to make some rules of thumb. In general, the slower elemental applications will trigger the reactions most often. This is because the faster one will outpace the slower one, and after a reaction happens, the auras will be cleared, and the faster one will likely apply the elemental aura before the slower one. That being said, a lot of times, reactions involve a character casting their skill that deals damage over time, then switching to another character to spam their own elemental application. If the slower applicator happens to be the first character in these situations, the second, faster character will be the one triggering the reactions for the first few times. It will come to a point where the faster one will begin to overtake the slower one to apply the aura instead of being the trigger, but I can't tell you exactly when that happens. So, rule of thumb, faster and first tend to be the aura applicators, and the slower and second tend to be the triggers. If you really care about who is your trigger, you can find out for yourself by seeing which aura exists before the reactions happen. I believe that one easy way to do this is for normal enemies, when reactions happen, both elemental icons of the reaction appear over the enemy's head. The elemental icon on the left is a triggering element, and the one on the right is the initial aura. Alright, the next thing we're going to be talking about is the duration that an elemental aura stays on the enemy. There are what we call weak elemental applications and strong elemental applications. The main difference is that weak procs leave the enemy with an elemental aura for 9 seconds, while strong ones leave the enemy with the aura for 12 seconds. We will call the duration that enemies are afflicted with an element the gauge of their aura. Strong procs also decrease the amount of shielding that the Fadui and Registines have more than weak procs. If you are wondering why this distinction is important, it is not because strong procs make the reactions do more damage, or that the more time an aura has in its gauge, the more damage the reaction does. That's not the case. The damage that the reactions do isn't affected by how much time is left in the gauge. What this does explain though is how cleansing works during elemental reactions. Weak auras are immediately cancelled out by weak triggers. The same is true for strong auras and strong triggers, as well as weak auras with strong triggers. But having a strong aura and a weak trigger leaves the enemy with the initial aura for a little while longer after the reaction. As for an explanation as to why this happens, imagine the gauge of an aura that the enemy has. When applying another elemental proc to trigger the reaction, the gauge of the triggering proc is subtracted from the initial aura's gauge. If the initial aura has no more gauge left, no aura remains. But if the triggering gauge is less than the aura's gauge, then the aura lasts for the rest of its duration. If this is the case, a weak triggering proc can still cancel out a strong aura if we wait a little while to shorten the gauge first, right? And yes, this is the case. I still don't see the use in this yet, is what you might be thinking. But on the other hand, you may have also thought that, hey, maybe we could still do another reaction with the remaining time in the gauge. Yes, it is true that you can do multiple reactions using a single application of a strong elemental aura. Just remember that these triggering applications have to come in quick succession after the aura is applied, because we still have to make sure that the aura still has some time left after the first trigger happens for the second one to make a reaction. I also noticed that sometimes reactions don't happen even when the enemy still has an elemental aura. I found out that if the aura only has about like half a second in its gauge or so, reactions can't happen with it, and your next element will just be applied instead. Basically, if an elemental aura has been blinking for a little while already, it pretty much just doesn't exist anymore. It can be immediately replaced by a different aura, and no reactions can happen with it. Also, when applying multiple procs of the same element, the aura that is left uses whichever gauge has more duration left in it. Like if a strong pyro aura existed for 5 seconds, then a weak aura was applied, the pyro will last for another 9 seconds using the weak applications gauge. But if a strong initial pyro aura existed for only 1 second, then a weak pyro aura was applied, the gauge will just stick with the initial aura's remaining 11-second duration. It is of note that in Melt and Vaporize, the lesser element in those reactions, Crow in Melt and Pyro in Vaporize, are taken down by 1 level in strength, meaning that when a strong Crow proc comes into contact with a strong Pyro aura, the Pyro aura's gauge will only be decreased by a weak amount. This makes trying to get reactions in rapid succession easier with amplification reactions, especially with a weak lesser elemental trigger to begin with. This is why Ganyu with her charge shot and bloom follow-up hits is actually good with melt, as long as you can shoot quickly after the pyro is applied. This is because the pyro aura is left after her charge shot, and her bloom, which does a lot of damage, can still melt, which means that surprisingly it has two separate crowd applications. Thank you so much to Yappy135 for telling me about this in the comments of my Ganyu video. Jordan, Slade, Jordan, can we get a pog in the comments for Yappy? Overloaded does pyro damage, and Superconduct does cryo damage in an AoE. Does Overloaded proc a pyro aura, and does Superconduct proc a cryo aura into nearby enemies? No. I'm gonna talk about what I know of Electro-Charge now. If you guys want more information about it, I have a link to a Reddit post that talks about things I can't even guess as to how they tested and found out. I'm about to tell you guys what I understood from that post, but you guys may want to check it out for yourself too. So what makes Electro-Charge special? Well, it is the only reaction where there are persisting elemental auras for a period of time, and two at that. Side note about Frozen, the enemy does have a cryo aura that you can do cryo reactions with. Its duration is also only as long as the shorter gauge it has between its cryo and hydro auras. You may have noticed that when an enemy is Electro-Charged, the electro and hydro aura exist on them for a period of time. Well, is this aura real, and can we do reactions with it? Is it just for show, or do these auras prevent other elements from being applied? As it turns out, when an enemy is Electro-Charged, hitting them with a cryo move will do both Superconduct and Frozen, and pyro skills made Vaporize and Overloaded happen. But doing these also made the Electro-Charge stop immediately. If these auras are real, do items that give you bonus damage against enemies afflicted by Electro or Hydro work during Electro-Charge? And yes, I tried it with the Thunder Soother set and I got bonus damage. My guess is that it works with every item that has effects like this, but you can try it out for yourselves if you want to make sure. Shout out to Tyron for pointing out that the Rain Slasher still has bonus damage during Electro-Charge. Jordan, Slade, Jordan, can we get another pog in the comments? There are some other fundamental differences between Electro-Charge and most of the reactions. So we established that both auras exist on the enemy at the same time. For other reactions, the triggering element can never stay on the enemy as an aura afterward, but either the triggering or initial aura can remain after Electro-Charge. Let's see how this works. During Electro-Charge, both auras have their own gauges that exist simultaneously on the enemy. Ticks of Electro-Charge damage happen once every second. Each tick of Electro-Charge damage removes 5 seconds from both of the aura's gauges, only 3 seconds for stronger auras. This is why for most Electro-Charge procs, talking about where both the Hydro and Electro auras are weak, 2 ticks seem to always happen, because the initial tick happens when the triggering element is applied, leaving both weak gauges from 9 seconds to 4 seconds left. Then a second passes, then the next tick happens, and removes 5 seconds from the rest of the gauge that only had 3 seconds already, cleansing both auras. If you were to wait 5 seconds or more to apply the triggering element, the Electro-Charge will only have 1 tick of damage, since the aura didn't have more than 5 seconds left in its gauge to begin with. Because the triggering aura still has some time left in its gauge, it persists on the enemy. So basically, when we are spamming Hydro and Electro together to do as much Electro-Charge as we can, we are merely replenishing the Hydro and Electro's gauges during Electro-Charge. And we aren't forcing the reaction to tick any faster or deal more damage. Apparently, there is an exception to the rate at which Electro-Charge can take damage, but it involves split-second timing using remaining auras, and I'm just hoping that it is too situational to be of any importance. I don't have confidence talking about it, but if you want to check it out for yourselves, you can look at the Reddit post link below. Electro-Charge can also deal electro damage to nearby enemies afflicted with Hydro if the triggering element was Electro on the subsequent ticks of Electro-Charge damage, but this does not apply Electro auras to those nearby enemies. As for Elemental Mastery, at the beginning of an Electro-Charge reaction, I say this because it can last longer if we keep replenishing the aura's gauges as it goes on, the first tick will use the triggering character's Elemental Mastery, but on subsequent ticks, whoever is the last character to apply either Hydro or Electro before the tick is the character whose Elemental Mastery is used. Let's talk about Swirl for a little while. It is the only reaction that spreads auras to other enemies, and it seems to leave the enemy with their original aura often too, but other times not. I haven't found sources that talked about Swirl like this while I was doing some light research, but after some of my own rudimentary testing, I have a theory that aligns with a lot of the concepts we talked about so far. So there does seem to be weak and strong Anemo skills. I found Sucrose's normal attacks and skill to be weak, and I found Lumine's press skill to be strong. On a single enemy, Swirl seems to behave very similarly to Melt and Vaporize, where Anemo as a triggering element is made one level weaker. I think this because when a weak Anemo trigger meets a weak aura, the original aura stays for a little while after. The same happens with a strong Anemo and strong aura. It took a strong Anemo skill to immediately cancel out a weak aura. And when a weak Anemo trigger met a strong aura, the aura lasted longer. The Anemo attacks do seem to decrease the gauge on the initial auras the enemies have. Here too, if we wait out the enemy's gauge for a little while then apply weak Anemo, the enemy's aura immediately disappears. Again, implying that Swirl decreases the enemy's existing aura rather than leaving behind an aura for a constant amount of time every time. Well, how does the spreading work? From what I have noticed, all of the spread auras seem to be weak applications in the Swirl's AoE, whether or not it came from a strong aura or an Anemo trigger. You can also make reactions off of the auras that were spread. When both enemies are afflicted by the initial aura and are both hit by the same Anemo trigger, they seem to spread the aura to each other, replenishing their gauges with a weak application of their initial aura. This means that they remain with the aura for the same amount of time after being swirled. Most multi-hit Anemo skills are slightly different though. They feature something called elemental absorption. This is different from Swirl. Once an element is absorbed, the Anemo attack will be doing some elemental damage along with each Anemo hit. It is the skill itself doing the elemental damage rather than it coming from the Swirl reaction. Remember how each skill has an application timer for their elements that prevents reactions from constantly happening? Anemo skills have these as well, and that's why Swirl is not constantly happening. The flurry of elemental damage comes from the damage accompanying the skill rather than Swirl constantly happening. If we observe Lumine's health skill, Swirl happens once at the beginning, then elemental absorption happens, and we get a lot of smaller pyro damage numbers. About halfway through the skill, we see the Swirl indicator again, along with the same amount of damage that the first swirl did, indicating that these two swirls are the only ones that happen throughout the duration of the skill. Even if it could have been explained by swirl happening a lot, the damage numbers would have had to have been the same, because the amount of damage that a reaction does relies on nothing else but the character's elemental mastery and level, which obviously can't change in the duration of the skill. As for how multi-hits apply elemental auras, it seems like damage from elemental absorption straight up applies weak auras onto the enemies as if it was an attack of that element. Alright, you made it to the end of the video. Did you guys learn anything new? Was it confusing? I hope I did explain things clearly and thoroughly for you guys, but just remember that what I talked about in this video is more complicated than what you really need for most of the game. This only helps you when you really want to think hard about spamming reactions, but you can still spam reactions even if you don't know these things. Even for me, up until now, most of the misunderstandings I have had with this game have come from situations like, is this aura applied on the enemy to set off this bonus damage boost? Does this reaction actually get triggered here? Or what type of damage is this part of the talent using? And stuff like that. The rest of this video is going to be about my future and past videos, and if you already learned everything you wanted to from this video, I did this at the end so you can get to watching your next video if you like. I just want to take the chance to say, when watching videos, take what they say with a grain of salt. And I encourage this for you when watching my videos too. I am just one person and I want to get videos out to you guys all of the time, and this meant rushing things sometimes. And realistically, I can't build every possible set for a character or try out every team comp, so I have to go off of my own reasoning sometimes. There's just so much I want to talk about in this game, and I think it's really exciting, but man, sometimes the details can get really convoluted in this game. One of the things I want to do least is to tell people something on a video, and they follow the advice, only to find out that it doesn't work like that, and that sucks. They trusted what I said and went through with it, and it didn't help me. I would hate to do that. I advise you guys to look at the comment section of my videos if you plan on listening to what I have to say. I can't really change a video once I uploaded it, even though I would love to make corrections that way, so I usually pin a comment if it brings up something important about what I said in the video if I made a mistake. That being said, I'll try to be more cautious when uploading things, and I made this video partly as an excuse to help myself learn more about these kinds of little details, so hopefully I am more prepared for my future videos already. I don't want to make too many assumptions anymore because assuming makes an ass out of you and me, and I don't want to be an ass. My teacher told me that once, and I thought it was funny, but I didn't get where the N between the U and ME came from. I don't think that's how you spell assume. But yeah, consider subscribing if you want to see more Genshin Impact videos. I do tips, character builds, team comps, and the occasional mess around video. Your guys' reception of me has been super nice so far, but I hope I can just give you guys even more solid advice in the upcoming videos. Thank you for checking out my channel either way, and see you next time.